Going to the title of the session, non-payment and creditor rights, and looking insular to the region, particularly UAE, Saudi, Kuwait, how does the implied protection of those rights as a creditor, basically, how does that not allow for the later workout in the region? You know, we come across, personally, every week, 2-3 cases of significant debt stacks of companies that have gone insolvent, entered default. This morning before coming here, we were in the office in a meeting with the sponsor of a company. The debt stack of the company is several hundred million dirhams. There's a club of, well, let's call it, there's lenders, 12 lenders inside the company, and they're just cannibalizing the company. It went into default 3 months ago, and the same protection of those rights doesn't allow for the let it worked out. Each lender has launched its own action, police cases. You know, some of the sponsors managed to leave, others are here, they're unable to work, they're making it really difficult for them to raise money. There's not even the word of provisioning. I can't provision against this loan. I can do it only maybe in 2 years or 3 years. So there's no, oh, I'm going to enter into insolvency like in the US or the UK. As soon as that happens, lenders already provision 30 cents on the dollar, 50 cents on the dollar, which will allow the company to come out on the other end, you know, create some equity value. Here, there's no provisioning. So there's this cannibalizing.
I mean, yes and no.
What has to happen to change this situation?
I think what has to happen in some jurisdiction, it's already happening. So, for example, if you look at the new bankruptcy law that's come out in UAE, it kind of deals with that in certain aspects.
Still unapplied.
Unapplied, exactly, and that's exactly what I'm coming to. And if you look at the new Saudi law, it deals with that as well, but again, it's unapplied. And I think in many ways, it's and again, we were talking about this earlier, in Chapter 11 took 20 years in US to be first applied. And people just wouldn't go to Chapter 11. It took 20 years for the first case to go through the court, and now that's the gold standard we all look at, right? And again, that's the point. When we look at Dubai, and we look at Saudi, and we look at Kuwait, we forget how young these jurisdictions are. They don't have hundreds and hundred years of legislative power behind them. I mean, 2009 was when somebody first thought that a Saudi company or a UAE company would not pay debt. I mean, I'm a banking and finance lawyer. I mean, it was unheard of. I mean, the only thing you did was you said, oh, I'm not paying it this far. And the reason you weren't paying as a company is because you were doing a new project. So you rolled over your loan. It was unheard of until 2009, 2010 that somebody would not pay. I mean, you were who you were and you were always going to pay. So from that to 2000, come forward 10 years, we only have had a period of 10 years when people have actually defaulted and banks have had to restructure, or the investors have to kind of pay in the crash calls, not because there's a new project, but because somebody is not doing, or a business is failing. So yes, the laws are untested, but that's the thing. They will have to be tested. If the things don't work, they will have to be tested. And in many ways, and I used to say this all the time, that is risk of doing business in this country. I mean, you know, when you're looking at a country risk, that is the risk. I mean, if you look at any PPM, or any offering document of any debt, any equity, any structured finance product, what is one of the risks that's out there? It's the laws are young, they haven't been tested, we don't know how they will be applied. And that is risk of doing the business, and part of that risk is also knowing that their returns are going to be different. And I think it's a balancing act. And do I think these laws are not going to be tested? I think it's a matter of time. They will be tested, and 20 years from now, maybe we'll be talking about them like we talk about Chapter 11.
So I think before you, that works is exactly right for when all the other options have almost been exhausted.
Correct.
But I think what you're talking about is almost before you get to that sort of bankruptcy, or you sort of need that protection. And actually, it's not this part isn't necessarily about the company. This is about the creditors. And the creditors have to start working together. Because I think the example that you've given is basically where everyone's tried to be the first one to the till to try and take out what they can, because that maximizes their returns in that one and minimizes everyone else's. Well, actually what tends to work in the longer term and on average will be if everyone works together, stabilizes the company, and gets whatever they can out of it. Because there's always more value from a trading business than a closed business. About 20 or 30, I think it's probably 30, 40 years ago, Europe had a similar problem, or the UK had a similar problem. And the top 5 banks at the time got together and coined the term the London approach, which was basically that in any restructuring case, all the banks would get together and they would work as a team to recover the value, because they saw exactly these things happening where they were all fighting for it, and actually it meant they were all getting worse. The first one, they might have got the assets that were left, but they were still much lower than if they'd also stood back, helped the business, and sort of shared the assets in the future. And that has then led, say, in the UK and Europe, to this consensual restructuring approach, which tends to deliver more value than going into administration or one of the processes in Europe. I think you need something in the Middle East to be able to do that, because every sort of restructuring I've dealt with, even when the banks are working together, they're always looking over their shoulder, waiting for someone else to stab them in the back and file an attachment over an asset, and it just makes it very hard to get a deal done.
Which ties into your earlier comment. Would you advise then essentially trying the consensual approach, but also being prepared for the worst case scenario, so that in the case somebody else does go for assets, then you're prepared yourself?
Yeah. Well, I think what needs to happen is to take away the emotionalism and sensitivity to the investment, and really trying to be more strategic, because coming from Cayman jurisdiction, that's why they started doing the provisional liquidation instead of going full force, because they know that what you need is a moratorium on people trying to enforce each and every claim. I've presented a petition, and within an hour of presenting the petition, have more than 15 other persons coming to defend additional claims. And that's where you have to step back and say, okay, the end goal here is a realization of assets. And therefore, that provisional circumstance is where I think jurisprudence needs to be tested more, to say, hey, okay, in this part, you assign somebody. It's just like with any team. You assign a proper coordinator, a group leader, somebody who will take charge of it, run through it, and be able to speak to each person's liabilities and assets as they go.
I mean, just to pick up the point that Nick was making, though, that is where a regulator in this region plays a lot bigger role than the regulators do in the other regions. There is a lot of soft handling of the banks in this region than it is in anywhere else, where the regulator would say to the banks and say, you have to work together. And I've seen that happen in restructuring, where banks, when they wouldn't move, the regulator have stepped in and said, and it would be just a public statement saying, we would require the bank, we recommend this would happen, and then things would start happening. And I think that's what's important.
We've seen the regulator here actually protect the banks by giving them forbearance to not provision an asset because it's too big to protect their impairment. So there's a lot of agency issues and conflicts of interest, because there's a lot of big sponsors behind, political issues. The banks can't simply absorb the loss or the impairment they will have to take on some of these exposures. So. But I have a question for you, Amaris, targeted at you,
Okay.
your expertise.
I should be worried, but go on.
What do you think is now the path that the creditors will take on Ahab and Saad? I'm not implying that you read the 1,500 pages.
Thankfully. So I think what's going to happen in Ahab is what's already happening. Ahab, they have 70% creditors on board for Ahab, and which represent 50% of the debt, which basically mean that if other creditors don't come on board, they can force bankruptcy provisions in Saudi Arabia and ask them to accept the settlement. So Ahab will go into restructuring in that sense. I mean, as to what's going to happen in the secondary market, I don't know what's going to happen in the secondary market, and that's the question. But Ahab has actually gotten there in many ways.
The position of the judge actually reverse the conception?
No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Because so just going back to what the judgment does, judgment deals with the claim and the counterclaim of Ahab and Al-Sana against each other. So basically, Ahab was asking for $4.1 billion from Al-Sana to pay, which they said was given away because of fraud. And Al-Sana had made a claim of $5.9 billion, a counterclaim. Represented in that action was 6 Cayman companies represented by Al-Sana as trustee, and they wanted that money. So because they did not want the money to go to Ahab, so they can get the money from Al-Sana's company. So that is what's happened in the case. So basically the court has said, both of you were complicit in this fraud, nobody's claim is going forward. Technically, that should free up the money for the Cayman companies to get, but they're not going to get it because there's going to be an appeal process. The scheme of arrangement that's happened in Ahab is actually happened in Saudi Arabia by the parent company. So the Cayman courts can't actually overrule that anyway. So that stays intact. What's happening with Al-Sana is more interesting because it has actually not been able to, from what I understand from the news, has not been able to reach a consensus with its creditors. So that would be a more interesting fallout to see, because those judgments, I think there are 42 banks with the judgments who can now start forcing the assets to be liquidated. They've already had the first auction and they can start forcing those actions to be liquidated. So that's going to be more interesting. What's interesting with the Cayman trust, 4 Cayman companies being represented, that were represented in Sana's cases, the trustee was actually appointed by the Central Bank of Bahrain, which was Charles Russell. So there are 2 jurisdictional issues because they fall within the group of all. I mean, Cayman and Bahrain, from what I remember from 3 years ago, is they actually have a reciprocity agreement, which the terms of which I don't remember and don't expect to quote. So that is going to be a more interesting play. But Al Ghoseibi investors are going to, creditors are going to be, Al Ghoseibi is in terms of processing with its steering committee, it's in a better position than Al-Sana at the moment. Because their scheme of arrangements in many ways falls within the Saudi law. And they, as a Saudi entity, can actually force it for others to go in right now.
I think a lot is going to depend on reciprocity of the foreign schemes of arrangement. Once they make that application for it to be sanctioned within the Cayman Islands, then it's something that has to be addressed by the Cayman entities. On the other hand, the actual order of the court itself, because of the appeal, I agree, a lot is going to be at a standstill until that appeal is dealt with. The liquidators are not going to want to distribute anything until such time as that's agreed, unless forced to do so by a foreign reciprocal order.
I mean, so if you're reading what Simon Charlton has been saying, who's the chief executive officer of Ahab, he said they're going to use a $2.1 billion, $2.9 billion, $2.5 billion loan that was given from the personal judgment to satisfy the creditors. They're going to use the financial and real estate assets of Ahab to satisfy. So he's not linking the repayment to getting the money out of there. All he said is if that money had come to us, it would have made payments easier. Because, so they've been very, very, I mean, if you look at what they're saying, at least Ahab is saying, is they're not linking the repayment, their ability to repay, to the judgment in Cayman. Mm-hmm. They're saying, we wanted to get that money and we're going to appeal to get that money, but we're still going to service our creditors. Unfortunately, Al-Sana hasn't been able to say that, and neither is its trustee, because they have to rely on that money. Does that answer your question?
Any other questions? Okay.
I think we've given them a mouthful.
I'd like to finish off by thanking you all our panelists and thank you all for attending.